Welcome to our Following the Footsteps of Joseph podcast today, our supplemental material to help with our understanding of the Doctrine and Covenants. Last time we met, we had an opportunity to talk a little bit about the ancestral beginnings of the Smith family here in the United States, the progenitors of the prophet Joseph Smith. 5 generations, in fact, all who lived in the Topsfield area, Topsfield, Massachusetts. That would be Robert, Samuel II, Asael Smith, and Joseph Smith Sr., all of them from Topsfield. Well, with that ancestral podcast under our belt, today we're going to have a podcast dedicated to geography. This particular podcast is going to take us around the state of Vermont, and for that matter, the state of New Hampshire, as we look and follow some of the early leadership of the church that hailed out of these 2 states. These first 4 podcasts, again, just by reminder, lead us up to the birth of Joseph Smith. But there's so many things that we need to understand before we really get into the details of his life. And one of those we're going to share today, this trip down the state of Vermont and New Hampshire as we study some of the key leadership of the church. I don't know if you realized it or not, but there are 20 key leaders of the church who are born in the Green Mountain state of Vermont. A number also hail out of New Hampshire, and these are the folks we're going to be reviewing today. Now, we'll be following Asael Smith as he leaves Topsfield and comes up into Vermont and the various places he'll live, as well as when Joseph Sr. marries Lucy Mack. We'll follow them around a bit, as well as the Mack family who lived in Vermont. And so we're going to be bouncing around just a bit, and I'll try to help keep this as straight as possible for you to follow and to understand. Going to begin at the bottom of the state of Vermont, and I've listed the mileage. The mileage is going to be from the birthplace of Joseph Smith. So in this particular case, Brigham Young, born in Whittingham, Vermont, is 104 miles south of where Joseph Smith was born. John Young, that's Brigham's father, had a 51-acre farm near Whittingham, Vermont, which he purchased for $100 from his brother-in-law, a fellow named Joseph Mosley. Brigham was born June 1st, 1801 in Whittingham. Brigham was the 9th child of John and Nabby Young. Now, the exact location of the family's cabin is not really known. However, someone did place a memorial stone on a site at the top of what is referred to as Brigham Young Hill or Stimpson Hill, identifying what they thought was perhaps the spot. And this little monument says, Brigham Young, born on this spot in 1801, a man of much courage and superb equipment. That's what the little plaque signs. So we assume it was in this particular vicinity that Brigham Young was born. In the Town Hill Memorial Park is found the 12-foot-tall memorial to Brigham Young. This location is the site of the old village of Whittingham. The monument was dedicated May 28, 1950, and is made of Vermont granite. Okay. Around the corner from Whittingham is the town of Marlboro. Newel Whitney was born February 5th, 1795, and Newel Knight on September 13th, 1800. Both were born in Marlboro, Vermont. Newel Whitney would become the 2nd bishop of the church in 1831, and later would become the presiding bishop of the church. Newel Knight was one of the earliest and dearest friends of the prophet Joseph. He eventually would live in Colesville, New York. And in April 1830, the first miracle of the church was performed on Brother Knight while living there in Colesville. The prophet cast out an evil spirit from him. Now, near Marlboro is the town of Rockingham, Vermont. Shadrach Roundy, prominent leader of the church in Kirtland and in the Nauvoo era, was born January 1st, 1789 in Rockingham, Vermont. Zerah Pulsifer one of the presidents of the 70s, was also born in Rockingham on June 14, 1789. Brother Pulsifer would later baptize Wilford Woodruff while on an Eastern States mission. The Rockingham Meeting House is one of the few surviving 18th century meeting houses. It is the most intact barn-like meeting house remaining in the state of Vermont. Now we're going to go a little west of here, and we're going to go over to Wells and Pulteney. This is the hometown of Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery, born in Wells on October the 3rd, 1806. He would live in Wells for 3 years and then move 30 miles north to the town of Pulteney. He would remain in the Wells-Pulteney area for over 19 years. In 1825, Oliver moved to Manchester, New York, where he taught school. Oliver was one of the 6 original members of the church, as well as one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. He also served as an assistant president to the church. Now, near Wells is the home place of Isaac and Elizabeth Hale. Now, this is Emma Hale's parents. They had a home there in Wells. Eventually, they're going to move, obviously, to Harmony, Pennsylvania. But Isaac inherited this particular home in Wells from his grandfather, and he married a Wells native resident. Her name was Elizabeth Lewis. And in 1791, Isaac and Elizabeth moved to the Susquehanna Valley in Pennsylvania. And that's where Joseph Smith would meet and eventually marry Emma Hale, their daughter, on January 27, 1827. One of my favorite places to visit is in Benson, Vermont. The 3 Carter brothers were born in Benson. Jared Carter baptized 27 converts in Benson and witnessed many healings. Jared's older brother, Gideon, was killed at the Battle of Crooked River on October 25th, 1838. Of course, we'll discuss this when we get into the far west era of our history discussions. The old stone Baptist meeting house is still there today, built in 1826. By 1831, it was converted into a meeting place for the Mormons, since most of the Baptist congregation were converted by Jared Carter. This congregation became the first branch of the church in Vermont. Now, on a personal note, Jared Carter also baptized one of my relatives. His name was John Tanner of the Lake George, New York area. John Tanner's donations to the Kirtland Temple saved it from being foreclosed on. Unfortunately, I'm also related to Gerald Tanner and Sandra Tanner. In fact, these are prominent critics of the church in Salt Lake City. I'm related to the Tanners through Hugh B. Brown. That line hails out of Cardston, Alberta, Canada. Now, not necessarily a site where anybody lived, but I want to refer to Ticonderoga, New York. Fort Ticonderoga is an 18th century star fort by the French, built by the French during the French and Indian War. That was 1756 through 1763. The fort was occupied by the British during the Revolutionary War. In May of 1775, it was captured by the Vermont Green Mountain Boys under the command of Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. So why am I showing you this star fort that's kind of in the area? On July 8, 1758, Solomon Mack, that's Joseph's maternal grandfather, was involved at the Battle of Ticonderoga. It was the bloodiest battle prior to the Civil War. 3,000 British and American soldiers were killed as they assaulted the fort. Solomon Mack was nearly killed when a ball passed within 1/2 inch of his neck. So that's kind of an important historical site and has some church significance. Now we're going to move up just a little bit to Woodstock, which is only 17 miles from the birthplace of Joseph. In the winter of 1843, William Hyde organized a branch of the church in Woodstock. The branch consisted of 35 baptized members. Now, while laboring in Woodstock, William and his companion, Erastus Snow, heard of Joseph Smith's martyrdom. Joseph was killed there, of course, in Carthage jail, and they were serving a mission near this Woodstock area at that particular time. William Hyde is the founder of Hyde Park in Cache Valley, Utah, over near Logan. Now we're going to go even a little closer now to the birthplace of Joseph Smith. Some 10 miles or so away is Pomfret, New York. This is the home of the Johnsons. Luke Johnson was born in Pomfret November 3rd, 1807. His brother Lyman was born there on October 24th, 1811. Both were members of the original Quorum of 12 Apostles from 1835 to 1838. Now, their sister, Nancy Miranda Johnson, wife of Orson Hyde, she was also born in Pomfret on June 28, 1815. Only 10 miles away is the small little, basically non-existent town today of Pomfret, Vermont. Luke Johnson was born in Pomfret on November 3rd, 1807. His brother Lyman was born there on October 24th, 1811. Both were members of the original Quorum of 12 Apostles from 1835 to 1838. Now, their sister, Nancy Miranda Johnson, wife of Orson Hyde, was born in Pomfret on June 28, 1815. Now, Luke was excommunicated from the church in 1838, but he was rebaptized in 1846. He died in 1861 in Salt Lake City, Utah, at the home of Orson Hyde. Lyman, his brother, was also excommunicated from the church in 1838, a difficult year of apostasy, which we will eventually discuss. But he drowned in the Mississippi River in 1859. Miranda Johnson Hyde became a plural wife of Joseph Smith in 1842, and she died in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1836. Now we're going to shift gears just a little bit and follow the Joseph Smith Sr. Lucy Mack family. At this particular point, Joseph Smith is born. He's about 10 years old or so. And in 1813, the Smith family moved from the birthplace location of Joseph Smith to the small town of Norwich, Vermont, just 16 miles away. This would be the last place that the family would live in Vermont before moving to Palmyra, New York. They would farm a stretch of land about 140 acres that was rented from Squire Constant Murdoch. At this location, Don Carlos Smith was born on March 25th, 1816. Now, 1816 would be called the year without a summer. Snow fell in June and July. This was because of the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. And we'll discuss that a little later as well. Well, because of 3 successive years of crop failure, the Smiths were heavily indebted, and as such, they were warned out of town. They resolved the debts that they had, and they left for New York. And today, the circled portion of this slide is that home that they lived in, and it still stands there today. You can still go to Norwich and see the last home the Smiths lived in prior to leaving for New York. Now, Norwich has a lot of interesting traditions, one being witching windows. That's the one on the angle that you'll see there, or sometimes referred to as coffin windows. After all, witches on broomsticks cannot fly at a 45-degree angle, and so you have this window put in on the side. Now we're going to move to Royalton, less than 5 miles from Joseph Smith's home. This is kind of an interesting site. In Royalton is found the home of Dr. Dennison. It's Dr. Joseph Dennison. Now, there's a sign on the home that said it was Dr. Dennison's home prior to 1815. Now, Dr. Dennison has a history of interfacing with the prophet Joseph Smith on 2 occasions. It seems that he was called to assist in the delivery of Joseph. Lucy perhaps was having some complications, and the doctor was called to come and assist. That's a little odd, because typically the women, the family members, would assist with the delivery, and to have a doctor brought in inferred perhaps there was a complication. And then, of course, Dr. Dennison, we find him in Hiram, Ohio, at the time of Joseph Smith's tarring and feathering while he was staying at the John Johnson home. It was Dr. Dennison who attempted to try and have Joseph ingest some nitric acid. So this man had some challenges. In fact, in his ledger, written in pencil on the side, is this notation relative to his birth. If I'd known how he was going to turn out, would have smothered the little cuss. So, lived nearby at the particular time. Now we're going to go right to the birthplace location of the prophet Joseph Smith, because we want to talk a little bit about Joseph's maternal grandparents. That would be Solomon, Mack, and Lucy. Solomon had a son that lived nearby. His name was Daniel Mack. His property, as well as Solomon's home, were located on this acreage now referred to as the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial. The Solomon Mack house was built sometime in 1790 and 1800. It existed on the property when Solomon purchased this particular piece. In fact, there were two homes. There was this home he would move into down below by the stream, and then on top of the hill is where eventually Joseph Sr. and Lucy, Solomon's daughter and wife of Joseph Sr., that's where they would live, and that would be where Joseph Smith Jr. would be born. This particular home was a clapboard-sided home with a handmade brick chimney. Just up the street was Solomon's son Daniel. He had a very large home, over 1,700 square feet. The cellar alone was 1,000 feet square. The property also had 3 terraced stone walls. One was 100 feet long, 360 feet long, and 460 feet long, probably used as terraces for orchards. At the time that Daniel lived here, he had a 13-year-old son named Wilder Mack living at home. This home is just, as I mentioned, just up the street there from Solomon's. And both these homes, again, are on the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial property. Now we're going to shift gears just a little bit and talked a little bit about Asael Smith's son. Now, Asael Smith, again, remember, he is the father of Joseph Smith Sr. He's the one that left Topsfield, Massachusetts, and moved to Tunbridge, Vermont. Well, he had a son named Stephen and a daughter named Sarah, and both these individuals are buried in the Royalton Cemetery near Highway 14. Stephen died on July 25th, 1802, at the age of 17, and Sarah married Joseph Stafford, and she died May 27th, 1824. Both of Asael's children are buried there in the Royalton Cemetery, very, very close to the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial. Now, shifting gears back to the Mack family a little bit, at the bottom of the screen, the little square green box is the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial, and you can see to the north of it, very, very close to it, is all of these sites that are property owned by the Macks. Solomon's two sons owned a good majority of the property up there. That would be Stephen and Daniel Mack. Now, Stephen was a prominent and prosperous farmer and businessman. He owned a sawmill, an oil mill. An oil mill is a grinding mill of oil-bearing seeds to extract vegetable oil. He had a fulling mill. Now, a fulling mill cleans and presses clothes. He had a clothier's shop for making cloth and rope and bags out of cloth. He had a tainter's bar. That's a device to control water flow, much like a floodgate. And he had a shop for cutting and heading rails for fences. So he was a very prosperous man. Now, Daniel Mack That's the other son that lived nearby. His property was purchased in 1799, and it is possible in 1804 that Solomon purchased this 100-acre farm on Dairy Hill from his son Daniel. Their properties are next to one another. So that's Dad and his sons kind of all living in the area just north of where Joseph Smith was born. Now we're going to shift gears from the maternal side to the paternal side and go with Asael Smith again, who came up from Topsfield, Massachusetts. And he would have 83 acres in the Tunbridge Gore area. A gore is poorly surveyed property. And when Asael, back in Topsfield, Massachusetts, heard there was property for sale cheaply in Vermont, gore property, this is where he would move to. And you can see that it's just a handful of miles from eventually where Joseph Smith would be born. Now this was the Asael Smith home on Ward Hill in the Tunbridge Gore. You see this picture? Nice home had there. Asael, in 1797, organized the Universalist Church, or the Universal Society. It had 15 members. Jesse and Joseph Sr., two of Asael's sons, were a part of this particular group. Universalists believe, and I quote, "There is one God whose nature is love, revealed in one Lord Jesus Christ by one Holy Spirit of grace, who will finally restore the whole family of mankind in holiness and happiness." Asael and Joseph Smith Sr. were not real fond of organized religion, couldn't find what they were looking for, and so they organized the Universalist Church. Now, the Joseph Smith Sr. property is located on Asael's property. Joseph Sr. was given property by Asael as a wedding gift when he married Lucy Mack. And that home right there is very close to where Asael's home was on property given Joseph Smith Sr. On that piece of property, Hiram and Alvin and Sophronia were born, three of Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack's children. Of course, that home is long gone today, and all you have is a depression of where the Joseph Smith Sr. Home in Tunbridge was. They would end up having living here in this home two different times. They're going to move from this home to a town called Randolph and then back to this home. Unfortunately, this home eventually is going to be sold to raise $800. The family was heavily in debt because of an incident that took place in Randolph, which I'll discuss with you in just a minute. But they ended up having to sell the property that they had in Tunbridge to get out of debt. Now, John Mudgett is an interesting individual. He was a business partner with Stephen Mack. He matched a wedding dowry of $500 for Lucy for her marriage to Joseph Smith Sr. Well, this $1,000 given by both John and Stephen would be used again to get the family out of debt because of the issue involved in Randolph. So they had to use this wedding dowry as well as sell their property in Tunbridge to get out of debt. John Mudgett died on January 27, 1801, at the young age of 29 years old, but he was a good friend of the family. Stephen Mack, this is again a son of Solomon Mack. He owned many businesses in Tunbridge, including the sawmill and village store. This is the location of the sawmill. Now, the village store, or general store, has a current building sitting on the very foundation that they had then for their village store. This particular store dates to 1820, but the foundation goes back to the 1795 village store owned by Stephen Mack. Now, in 1802, Joseph Sr. and Lucy are going to move to Randolph. This is what I've been alluding to for just a bit. There they opened up a mercantile store, a lot like Stephen Mack had, and that Lucy worked in. They wanted to get into that kind of business. While living there in Randolph, Lucy became seriously ill with tuberculosis. She covenanted with the Lord that if he would spare her, that she would devote her entire life to the search for truth. As Lucy looked for truth, she said, "I was disappointed there was not then upon the earth the religion that I sought." That wasn't the only challenge they had in Randolph. While living in Randolph, Joseph began crystallizing ginseng root. Ginseng was found and collected in the forest there in Vermont. He shipped his ginseng root to China because China was desperately looking for ginseng. This was used for perfume and for medications and things. And so he's going to ship this to China. A neighbor, Mr. Stevens, was responsible for taking the ginseng root to China, and he sold it in China for over $4,000, easily enough money to have compensated for the loan the Smiths received to purchase all the goods they needed for their mercantile store. However, when Stephen returned, he told Joseph that the venture did not go through, that he had not received any money for the ginseng root. And then he fled to Canada. Well, they pursued after him for having embezzled Joseph Sr.'s money, but they were unable to capture him. This would ultimately lead to Joseph and Lucy having to sell their Tunbridge property, and then Lucy having to forfeit her wedding dowry to get the family out of debt. The family would then live on property owned by Lucy's father, Solomon Mack, in Sharon, Vermont, where Joseph Jr. would eventually be born. So Dad came to the rescue, as dads often do. In this case, it was Lucy's father helping them out and letting them live on a home that was there on the property that Solomon Mack had. Joseph Sr. would never, after this particular incident, own property again outright in his life. Now we're going to shift gears and go north of the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial. 63 miles north is the Danville branch of the church, which consisted of 23 members, primarily due to the proselyting of John Boynton, an original member of the Quorum of 12 Apostles who served a mission in this particular area. Danville's also kind of interesting. It hosts the annual Dowsers Convention for those that are interested in divining rods. This is kind of fascinating. Oliver Cowdery had this particular gift, apparently, the gift of working with a sprout. Revelations Book 1, 1829b. In 1833, the Book of Commandments, it's referred to as the gift of working with a rod. And in 1835 edition of the D&C, we find it referred to as the gift of Aaron. So they have this convention of sorts there with those that are interested in working with divining rods, dowsers. Erastus Snow, a member of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, was born in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, just a little bit up from this. From Danville is the location of St. Johnsbury. He was born there in November of 1818. Erastus was converted when he heard the testimony of Orson Pratt and Luke Johnson, who were visiting the area there in 1832. From July the 17th through the 19th of 1835, the 12 Apostles held the first Vermont Conference of the Church in St. Johnsbury. The St. Johnsbury branch consisted of 41 members. The conference was represented by 7 churches, or branches of the church, and the Sunday session of the conference was attended by more than 1,000 people. Now we're going to go farther north now, over 100 miles north, and actually quite very close to the Canadian border. We find the town of Sheldon, Vermont. On June 14, 1801, Heber C. Kimball was born in Sheldon, Vermont. In fact, all 7 of the Kimball children were born in Sheldon. The Kimballs lived on a 200-acre farm near the confluence of Black Creek and the Missisquoi River. Heber was an original member of the 12 Apostles. On July 5th, 1976, a granite monument was placed in the Sheldon Creek Cemetery in honor of Heber C. Kimball. It was dedicated by President Spencer W. Kimball, a great-grandson. Heber was baptized a member of the church because of one very well-placed Book of Mormon by Samuel Smith, the first missionary of the church in 1830. Now, long ago, Vermont used to be part of New Hampshire, so it only makes sense, perhaps, that there's a few early and great ones that would come from the New Hampshire side of things. Down in southern New Hampshire, very close to the border there, New York, is the home of two people, Josiah Stowell and King Follett. Josiah Stowell was born here on March 22nd, 1770. He moved from here to Colesville, New York. He was a very successful farmer and employed Joseph Jr. and Joseph Sr. to help him find a lost Spanish silver mine near Harmony, Pennsylvania. Joseph became very good friends with Josiah Stowell, and Josiah Stowell was a defender of the prophet Joseph Smith on a number of occasions. Now, King Follett was born also in Winchester on July 26, 1788. He was baptized in the spring of 1831 when living near Kirtland. He was the last member of the church to be released from the Columbia, Missouri jail as a result of the 1838 Mormon War. Follett was killed on March 19, 1844, when digging a well in Nauvoo. One of the most prophetic discourses delivered by Joseph was done at the funeral services of King Follett. It is referred to as the King Follett Discourse. Lorenzo Snow, who would later aphorize the sermon, said, "As man is, God once was, and as God is, man may become." We're going to go north just a little bit to Chesterfield, New Hampshire. In Chesterfield, New Hampshire, on April 11, 1778, John Johnson was born. He'd later moved to Hiram, Ohio, and it would become eventually the headquarters of the church from September of 1831 to September of 1832. At the John Johnson home, Joseph would receive 15 revelations, including section 76, the 3 degrees of glory. At that home also, Joseph would be tarred and feathered. On March 24th, 1832, Joseph would recount, and I quote, "I found myself going out of the door in the hands of about a dozen men. Some of those hands were in my hair, and some had hold of my shirt, drawers, and limbs. They had concluded not to kill me, but to beat and scratch me well, tear off my shirt, drawers, and leave me naked. They ran back and fetched a bucket of tar, and they tried to force the tar paddle into my mouth. All my clothes were torn off except my shirt collar, and one man fell on me and scratched my body with his nails like a mad cat." Again, that happened at the John Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio. Now, Joseph's maternal grandfather, Solomon Mack, this is his hometown. Gilsum is referred to as Solomon Mack's home. Okay? Nearby Marlow, another town just up the street a bit, is the home of Solomon Mack's brothers and sisters. So this is kind of Mack country. Lucy Mack, Joseph's grandmother, was born in Gilsum on July 8, 1775. This particular genealogy sheet had an incorrect date I had to correct. Her birth home site is located about 150 feet from the Centennial Bond Cemetery, where her father, Solomon, is actually buried. Solomon's burial location is adjacent to other extended Mack family. The burial location is near and on top of a crypt that is used to store coffins with bodies during the winter, when the ground is frozen and too hard to dig. Gilsum has other evidences of Mack legacy. There's Mack Road right there. This is interesting. Mud season is not really folklore. but very real in the Vermont, New Hampshire area. And every small town has its village general store, as Gilsum had. Marlow, next door, is a very patriotic little village. In the distance, we see Mack Mountain. That's what it's referred to, from the cemetery here where Solomon is buried. And you see that there are various Mack family members that are listed here on a plaque dedicated to those who served in the Revolutionary War. Now we're going to flip back over again to Asael Smith's property. Asael Smith was is the fellow who the father of Joseph Smith Sr., who left Topsfield, Massachusetts, ended up going to Tunbridge. Okay, but prior to going to Tunbridge, he lived for a while in Manchester, which is referred to as Dairyfield, and his property today is the Pine Grove Cemetery. He had a 100-acre farm here, and while here at this particular Dairyfield or Manchester, John Smith was born. He'd be the 5th patriarch of the church and president of the Diamond Stake. You can see that Asael would eventually, as I've mentioned, sell his Topsfield home and property and swap places with his brother Samuel, return to the birthplace home in Topsfield to try to take care of their stepmother and liquidate their father's assets. We discussed this in depth in our last podcast. Now, Joseph Smith Sr. would eventually, after the birth of Joseph, move, and we're talking Joseph the prophet, he'd move to West Lebanon, New Hampshire, just across the Connecticut River that divides the two states. That home right there no longer exists, but it did exist for a period of time until 1967, when it was torn down. This is where the family lived. Today, there is a KFC Taco Bell in its place. The acronym of KFC I've changed from Kentucky Fried Chicken to Knowledge, Faith, and Courage. It was here that the plague of typhoid fever devastated the New Hampshire countryside, and here it was that heroes were made. And one of those heroes would be Joseph's older brother Hiram, and another Nathaniel Smith, the founder of Dartmouth Medical School. So we're getting about ready to conclude, but I want to talk about this particular incident here. Up the street from this KFC, or this West Lebanon home site of Joseph Sr., where young Joseph Jr. contracted this typhoid fever, is Moore's Academy. Moore's Academy is where Hiram attended school while living in West Lebanon. It's about 4.5 miles up the street. It's on the campus of what today is Dartmouth Medical School. Now, while attending school, Hiram perhaps talked about Joseph and his leg issue, the problem he was having with his leg because of this terrible disease that he contracted. And perhaps it was there at Moore's Academy that Nathan Smith, founder of Dartmouth Medical School, heard of the issues involving the Smith family, and perhaps then Nathan Smith and others accompanied him to the Smith home in West Lebanon and took a look at Joseph's leg. And of course, the leg operation took place, and the rest is history. And we'll discuss that much more so in our next podcast. Well, with so many stories and so many players involved in these two states, little did Joseph Jr. know that his best friends just lived down the street from him. Vermont and New Hampshire, I think, are always going to be remembered to be the cradle of church leadership. So from small beginnings, great things came to pass. I hope you've enjoyed our topographical or geography tour of these two states today, and have found some understanding that there was a lot of folks that would become prominent members of the church that lived very, very near where Joseph Smith was born. I might say one last concluding thing, that the reason so many of these people then would interact with young Joseph as prophet of the church in the New York area was because of that eruption of Mount Tambora in 1816. Those 2 or 3 years surrounding that eruption, there was no crops being grown in in Vermont or New Hampshire. Everybody left for New York, where they had heard that crops were growing in abundance there. So a lot of people, including the Smiths, would go to New York, and Joseph eventually would interface and interact with a lot of these good folks that actually were his neighbors right there in Vermont. Thank you for joining me. Our next podcast is going to get a little bit more into the history of Joseph Smith from Sharon, Vermont, through and including to the time that they would leave and go to New York. They're going to leave from Norwich and go to Palmyra. But you need to understand what took place with young Joseph during that particular period of time. So we'll spend some time talking about that. Probably do it in the form of a tour. I'm going to take you on a tour through the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial Museum. And as we do that, we'll talk about some of these things that took place with young Joseph when he was just a child.